I think it's a legitimate request from the US to say we need to do more. And I don't think the right response is simply to push back and say, no, we're not going to do anything.
How concerning, or is it concerning, that the US is reviewing the three-way AUKUS deal?
Well, it depends on whether you're pro-AUKUS or anti-AUKUS. The bottom line is I think that there is a real prospect of a change in path. Now, that doesn't mean that the US will cancel AUKUS, but I do think they are going to look very closely at what is termed the optimal pathway for AUKUS, so the schedule under which Australia will receive submarines and the conditions under which Australia receives submarines. And I think there are a number of elements there that are up for grabs, and we may see a change in the plan.
For AUKUS critics then, is this the off-ramp Australia needs from its $368 billion nuclear submarine play?
Well, I don't know what Donald Trump is thinking. I don't know what Pete Hegseth is thinking, but I don't think we're going to see an outright cancellation of it. What I do think will change is possibly the schedule. So at the moment, we're meant to receive the first Virginia-class submarine transferred from the US Navy in 2032, and then a subsequent submarine around about 2035, and then another one 2038. That may change. So one of the problems that the whole enterprise is facing, and Elbridge Colby, who is senior defence official and Pete Hegseth's assistant, has been very public about this. He has said the US doesn't have enough submarines for itself, let alone to provide submarines to Australia. So providing Australia with submarines will impact US Navy capability. And Pete Hegseth is aware of that as well. So it is possible that the US may say, well, we're still committed to AUKUS, but we may need to delay the delivery of submarines. So that is one potential outcome of this review.
And as you point to it, as I understand, it's the production of new US submarines that's languishing, and the federal government, read Australian taxpayers, is paying up to fast-track that manufacture. Do you think this means there is a possibility that the Australian government will be on the hook for more cash?
Well, so one of the things we do know is Donald Trump is not a fan of anything to do with Joe Biden. So he, thought Sleepy Joe did terrible deals. And so his starting point is that AUKUS is a bad deal. Now, his deputies, such as Pete Hegseth, may convince him that it's not a bad deal, but Donald Trump will want to see a better deal. So he is going to want to see more out of Australia. And there's two areas where he will want to see more. So the first is, yes, a greater Australian contribution into the US industrial base, so potentially more than the $3 billion US dollars that we have agreed to provide. But then there is a much bigger issue that we've all been following for the last couple of weeks, namely how much does Australia pay for its own defence? So what percentage of GDP does Australia pay? The US has made it very clear that it expects its partners and allies to pay more. And indeed, Pete Hegseth has named a figure in 3.5% of GDP. Australia is currently at 2%. And on a very slow trajectory to hit about 3.3% sometime in the 2030s. So from the US perspective, that's not good enough, and Pete Hegseth set a figure. It's the same figure that the US has told its European allies to hit as well. Anthony Albanese basically said, nope, we will determine how much we pay. So he pushed back, and that will have not gone unnoticed in Washington. So the US is saying, well, we're making a sacrifice here. We are giving you boats that we need ourselves. So we're taking a hit, we're making a sacrifice, and you guys don't seem to be willing to do the same thing. So, there is a real issue at stake here from the US perspective. And again, that doesn't mean cancelling AUKUS, but they want to see more in return from Australia.
Well, I know you're a fan of increased defence spending. Last time we had you on the program, you said 3%. Do you think the US perspective is fair?
Well, there's different ways of looking at this. I mean, the US way of looking at it is they are currently spending around about 3.5%. So they're going, well, we have underpinned the security of our allies around the world for the last 80 years, and we've been spending a lot more than you have. So is it fair, is it ethical for, Mr. and Mrs. Man in the street, woman in the street in Ohio to be spending that much to protect allies who aren't willing to spend the same amount? Now, is the right number 3%? Is it 3.5%? We can debate that. But I think there is general consensus amongst everybody who works in this space that 2% is not enough, particularly if you want exquisite, highly expensive capabilities like nuclear-powered submarines. You can't do that on a 2 and a bit percent of GDP defence budget. The effect of trying to do it on that budget is that all of your other capabilities are going to suffer. The opportunity cost is too great for you to have the full range of capabilities you need and still get nuclear-powered submarines. So the exact answer we can debate, but I think it's a legitimate request from the US to say we need to do more. And I don't think the right response is simply to push back and say, nah, we're not going to do anything.
What are the implications here for the defence industry in Australia, private sector in particular? Are there opportunities?
Well, certainly there are a lot of opportunities for Australian industry under AUKUS, both in the submarine stream and the other parts of AUKUS, the so-called Pillar 2 parts of AUKUS, so advanced capabilities like AI and hypersonic weapons, and there's a big long list of things there. So Australian industry is trying to gear up for that. Not a lot of progress has been made in the Pillar 2 space, but things have been coming along in the Pillar 1 space. Australian businesses have been getting qualified to work with the US, to work on nuclear-powered technologies. And so there is a lot of optimism there. Now, so far, the actual work, the actual contracts have been more in the infrastructure space. So doing work in Western Australia to allow the US to rotate submarines through HMAS Sterling under the so-called SURF West, so Submarine Rotation Force West, that will start in 2027 when American submarines will start rotating through on a permanent basis. So we are starting to see green shoots of development in Australian industry. Plus, there is also hopes that we can feed into the US's own submarine program, which is obviously a much bigger program than ours. So if you can get your foot in the door there as a supplier, that opens, the way to, quite lucrative contracts. Now, obviously, if AUKUS falls over, that's not going to happen for Australian industry.
Well, Richard Miles says we don't need a plan B, do we?
Well, I would have to disagree with Mr. Miles on that. Now, it depends on what you mean by Plan B. So is Plan B something that we would do instead of AUKUS right now, or is Plan B your hedging strategy, your risk mitigation strategy? Now, all smart businesses, if they want to stay in business, have hedging strategies. So if their main line of investment doesn't pan out, you want to have other options ready. And I would argue we need to be doing other things in the event that AUKUS doesn't deliver or doesn't deliver on the time frame we want it to. So that doesn't mean necessarily walking away from AUKUS. It doesn't necessarily mean buying a so-called interim submarine, so going to the Japanese or the Koreans or the Germans and saying we want some conventional submarines to tide us over. But it does mean we need to be looking at other capabilities that can deliver the sorts of effects we want from submarines, such as long-range strike, that we make sure that we get that even if AUKUS is delayed or potentially even cancelled. So I do think there is room for thinking around a plan B, but those are things we need to be doing as well as, not necessarily instead of.
Well, South Korea's Hanwha group this week says it has US approval to take a 100% stake in Australian shipbuilder Austal. That could be Australian shipbuilding capability going offshore. Do you think the Foreign Investment Review Board should be approving such an idea?
Well, so Austal is an Australian-owned company, so it would have to go through the FIRB, the Foreign Investment Review Board, for them to buy the Austal parent company, which is an Australian company. So, in a sense, the US can approve it, but the Australian government has to approve it. So there are some pros and cons to that. But I would say the first thing is the South Koreans aren't interested in buying Austal to take it offshore. They want to buy it to get a foot in the door, both in the Australian military shipbuilding market and the access that would provide into the US shipbuilding market. So, one of the things that both the US and Australia are aware of is we are being massively outbuilt by China at the moment. So we need to get South Korean capital and South Korean shipbuilding expertise into both of our countries to improve our naval shipbuilding industry. So the idea would not be to offshore production, in my view, but to improve and accelerate production here in Australia. And the South Koreans are world's best practice in both commercial and naval shipbuilding. So there's probably upside to this. There is one downside to it potentially, and that is currently Australia is conducting a competition for its general purpose frigate program, so an 11-ship program. And many of those ships are meant to be built in Western Australia, potentially at Austal shipyard. If that's owned by the South Koreans, the Japanese may have some qualms about that program because they may have some issues about handing their IP over to the South Koreans because they're big rivals in shipbuilding. So there's potentially upside, but there are a few downsides we need to be aware of.
Marcus Hellyer, thank you so much.
Thank you.